Hello there, my name is Marilla Walker. I'm a sewing pattern designer and welcome to the Sewing Weekender, and thank you so much for coming to watch my video. I'm going to just run through how to plan and make a tiered skirt like this one here, which is a skirt made up of only rectangles. It has an elasticated waist here. There's a top panel here which I will be referring to as tier 1, and then there's another panel here which is tier 2, and it's just simply gathered onto the top tier. So it's a really nice and simple patternless skirt to make, and I've also put together just a little worksheet to for you to read alongside the video, just to give you more of an understanding, or hopefully make it a bit clearer about some of the things I'm running through. So basically I will be showing you my version of this skirt. I've part made one here, so I've got a few finishing touches to put to it which I can run through with you. So what I shall be going through is how I have specifically measured for this skirt here, and how I've worked out how I'm going to cut my fabric. But really it's such an adaptable style to make. You can follow my instructions, or you can just use or follow my measurements, should I say, or you can just completely disregard them and work it out how you want, depending on what fabric quantities you've got, what your measurements are, how tall you are, how long you want your skirt, how many tiers you want, because you might want more than two. It's really adaptable, and you can just basically do your own thing. So I'll try and run some of those things, run through some of those things with you, and hopefully you will come away knowing exactly what to do and be able to make it as to your own personal preferences. Great. Right, so the first stage is to work out how much to cut of your fabric. So this first tier width is probably the most important bit. So I've worked this out by measuring my hips at the widest part, which is at the bottom of my bottom for me. It might differ for other people, but that's my largest part where I would like the ease to sit the most comfortably. So I've added 20 centimeters to that measurement, and that is how long I want my first strip of fabric that will be wrapping around my entire body. That's how long I want it to be. So it's my hip measurement plus 20 centimeters of ease, or you can go with more ease, again depending on your measurements, how much fabric you've got, etc. And then the depth, so the depth that I've cut it to, and that's got all of my seam allowances and everything included. I've cut 38 centimeters, which has then been used as seam allowance. It's been turned over for an elastic casing, but it started out measuring 38 centimeters long, and I think that, or shorter, it gives a nice finished length to your first tier, because any longer and it can just look a bit tubey, and it just doesn't sit quite, or well, I personally think it doesn't sit quite as nicely on the body. So that or shorter. So you could do 25 centimeters if you like, and just have more shorter tiers, if that makes sense. So that's for your tier 1. So I've got my rectangle, which is my hip measurement plus 20 centimeters of ease by 38 centimeters deep. So that's what I've ended up cutting. And then for the tier 2, for the bottom layer, I've cut the same depth again, so 38 centimetres, and I've taken that hip plus 20 centimetres measurement, and then I've times it by 1.5. So the bottom tier, the strip, will be 1.5 times bigger than the first strip, and that will give you a nice amount of gathers. So it won't be too full, but it won't be too sparse either. So this is what it's ended up sewing up like. So if, say, my tier 1 was a strip that was 100 centimetres wide, the second strip would be 150 centimetres wide. So it's as simple as that, but obviously you're going to do your own measurements. So that's just a rough idea of what you can do. Like I said, you can vary the depths of the tiers. You can times it by 1.25 times the first tier if you want less gathers, or you can even go up to 2 times the width of the first tier if you want it really, really full, which I believe is what I did on this one, which is a much flowier viscose fabric. So it can take having more gathers and it's not necessarily pokey outy, whereas on this one it might have just puffed it out a bit much, or a bit more, and give a different look. I mean, you might want that look, it depends what you're going for, but for this particular skirt that wasn't what I was going for, so I've just done 1.5 times width. So hopefully I've said that enough times. Right, we'll move on to the next bit. Right, so you've written down all of the measurements of the pieces of fabric you need to cut. Now you need to work out how to lay it out on your fabric. So I've got a few suggestions here on my worksheet, so I'll just quickly run through those, because it really is a great project for using up odds and ends of fabric. So if you happen to have a long narrow strip for whatever reason in your stash, this is a possible layout that you could use, and that would be to cut down the or plan out your rectangles along the length of the fabric if you didn't have a directional print. So then they would just be cut in 2 long strips for tier 1 and tier 2. That way, when you've joined them into a tube, you would just have one seam that you could line up on the back of your skirt for both tiers, and it would be even easier construction. So you'd only be dealing with one seam. And also you might be able to mismatch fabrics. So if you had 2 long strips, you could mix and match your fabric prints or colour block in similar weights of fabric, so you could really have fun with that. And then the second option I've got here is cutting tier 1 if your measurements were within the width of your fabric. For tier 1, you could just get that out in one strip along the width of the fabric, and that's a great fabric saving way of doing it. So you would only have one seam on that tier once you've sewn it into a tube, but then tier 2 wouldn't fit in one long strip, so you would have to cut that in 2 parts. You would divide your measurements by 2 and then add on the seam allowance back onto that when you're plotting out. I mean, what you would be doing to mark them out on your fabric here would be just marking it in chalk and a ruler. So you wouldn't have a paper pattern here, you would really just be marking down your measurements on the fabric. So yeah, we've split it into 2 parts for tier 2, so you would have 2 side seams. So you would sew it into a tube and you would have 1 side seam, 2 side seams. So for your tier 1, you could match up your seam there with whichever side seam you choose to, just so that they run in a nice line and it all looks nice and neat. And then the third option, so if your measurements put you outside of being able to fit tier 1 along the width of the fabric, here's another plan that shows splitting tier 2 into 2 pieces, just like we did for tier 2 on that second layout. Then you would be able to nicely match up your side seams on both sides of the skirt, and actually you might prefer to do that anyway, just for a more symmetrical look. I mean, I have cut a tiered skirt where I've literally just torn my fabric into strips of the same depth. So I think on that occasion I was using like 25 centimeter deep strips of fabric, and I just tore the whole length of fabric into 25 centimeter strips, and then I just kept joining them all together and then dividing it. So I had my first tier, and then the second lot was 1.5 times that width, and then the next lot was 1.5 times that second tier, until I had a nice long skirt. So I think it probably only had 3 tiers actually, but that was a really economical. So it did have more seams in each tier because I just joined all of these strips together to make my tubes. So there was no particular side seams or anything, but it was quite a busy print, and they're all hidden within the skirt, and I don't mind that, but that might bother someone else, so you might want to plan it a bit differently. But really, if you're wanting to make the most of your fabric, you can have seams all over the place. It really doesn't matter. So that's planning out how to cut your fabrics. You can be as relaxed or as formal as you like with that bit. Okay. Right, so you've cut your fabric out, so now you're ready to join everything together and construct your skirt. So as you can see, I sewed the tier 1 into a tube, and this only has 1 seam, and tier 2 was sewn into a tube, and that has 2 side seams. So I've matched tier 1 up with one of those side seams. Is this the right one? No. So it must be here. There we go. So that's matched up just there. And then to join tier 1 to tier 2, I've got a trick for lining them up so that you can distribute your gathers really evenly. Okay, so what I have done here is for each tier, before I pinned them to sew them together, oh, that's going to be confusing because that's showing the gathered side, so let me just turn that inside out. So let's just pretend that tier 2 is not joined on so far. So what I did was, for the edge that's going to be sewn into the seam, I folded my tube in half, and then I did a snip. Where is it? Ah, there it is. So just a little snip into the edge of the fabric. Hopefully you can see that. Just to mark the halfway point and the halfway point. And also, again, this way, so this, where the seam so what I did was I got my where my seam is, and then I folded the tube in half, so the seam signifies one halfway point, and then I've done a little snip into the edge of the fabric just there, which signifies the other halfway point, and then you fold it in half again, and then you get your edges and you mark the quarterway point and the quarterway point. And I did that on both of the tiers where they were going to join in that seam. So I did that for tier 2 as well. I split it into quarters, so I knew how to align it to tier 1, so that after I'd done my gathering stitches, I would be able to pin it so that it was all equally it was all equally pinned together. So I knew that the amount of fabric that I had extra of in between each section was exactly quarter, you know. So when you get to the gathering bit, you're gathering the same amount in each quarter, if that makes sense. Hopefully that does. So before you actually pin the two pieces together though, what you need to do is just add or sew 2 lines of gathering stitches. So I've got one line here which is about 1/2 centimetre away from the fabric edge, and another line here which is about 1 centimetre away from the fabric edge. So I'm using seam allowance of 1.5 centimetres. So these 2 gathering lines, they will sit inside my seam allowance, so they won't be seen from the outside of the skirt. Now, as you can see, I've already actually sewn quite a lot of this, so I've just left 1/4 open so I could just run through that with you. Right, so what I've got here is, these are where my tail ends are. So what I should just quickly explain is, for my gathering stitches, because I only like to gather half of the tube at a time, I've done gathering stitches from 1/2 marker to another, and then I've taken it away from the machine, so I've got tail ends at each half of the marker, and then I've done gathering stitches for the other half of the tube, and it just makes it easier to have tails to pull at each halfway marker for when you're doing your gathers, rather than gather stitching around that one long tube, which is it's quite a lot of fabric to gather all in one go. Right, so to pull my tail ends, so I found those just here, what I shall do is I'll just pop a little pin in here like that, just so it's sticking up. Probably I should put it the other way actually. There we go. Right, so I've got the head of the pin here, and then I just pull the ends. So for gather stitch, I always just use the longest length straight stitch on my sewing machine, which for me is 4.5 millimeters. And doing that longer straight stitch actually just it creates a looser stitch because the tension on it is never as good. So it just allows you to pull the threads a lot easier. Sometimes it might be, depending on your machine, it could be the top thread that pulls easier or the bottom thread. So you just need to give them a light tug and see which one works for you, so you can decide which one you want to pull. Okay, right, so I've gathered that along so that it matches the length of the top tier, and what I will do with my tail ends is I then use that pin and I just wrap them around in a figure of 8 around the pin, so as if you were securing some blind cord or something, you know, to stop the blind going up. So you just do that with your thread ends and it stops them from pulling back into the gather. And then I will just even the gathers out along the fabric so it kind of feels like it's roughly the same all along. You haven't got more gathers in one spot than you have another. And then I'll just pin that in place before I head over to my sewing machine. So because I'm only doing a quarter, probably only requires a couple of pins. Okay, so there we go. So I'm just going to sew that together now. Right, so I've just been over and I've sewn that all in now, so it's completely joined tier 1 to tier 2. And then I'll just go through and cut all these tail ends off, and just simply finish this seam edge with a zigzag stitch, which is the finish I've used. Let's see if you can see that, just here, just a zigzag over the edge of the seam allowance. I find it works well enough, rather than dragging out my overlocker just to do those edges. And if you don't have an overlocker, zigzag stitch works just as well, in my opinion. I really like it for a simple finish. So the hem edge I have actually already sewn, so this is the skirt hem. Right, so let me see if I can hold this up. Okay, so there we have it without the elastic yet in the waistband. So for the hem, all I did was I folded over 0.7 centimeters twice, and then pressed it, top stitched it down really close to the edge. So just a nice neat little hem finish there. Right, now I've already pressed and mostly sewn my waistband casing. So what I shall do is I'll show you on this edge again. So for the waistband casing, I just turned over 1.5 centimeters by a further 5 centimeters, pressed it, top stitched it down, but what I did leave was an opening of about 10 centimeters so I can thread my elastic through. Now I'm using a 4 centimeter wide elastic, so I've pressed a channel of 5 centimeters because I don't like it to be too tight to the elastic, because you find you'll struggle to get it in there, or you know, if you don't sew it really precisely all along, there might be bits that are narrower that the elastic gets kind of puckered up in. So I like to add at least a centimetre, well, a centimetre. You probably don't want to go more than that, but yeah, and it all depends on what your width of elastic is. So I've got a nice wide 4 centimetre one, but you don't have to use that. If you've got something narrower in your stash, go with that, and then just adjust your measurement for your casing according to your elastic width. So the width of your elastic plus 1 centimetre, and then the turning seam allowance as well on top of that. Hopefully that makes sense. So what I thought was I left the elastic out so I could put that through with you. So let me just show you how I do that. Not really, you might already know how to do this, and I don't know if you've seen one of these before. It's a bodkin. I had one in my, or I've seen one in my mum's sewing kit for the whole time I was growing up, and I never knew what this was for. But what it's like is, see, it's got like 2 little grippy hands almost, and when you pull this ring down, it tightens those together, so it really grips. It's got like little teeth on the end, so you pull the ring down to loosen it up, and then you pop that over your elastic, push the ring down so it really grips onto your elastic really tightly, and then you can use that to thread it through your channel. If you don't have one of these, you can just attach a safety pin to the end, and that works really well too. Talking of safety pins, I did have one somewhere, but I seem to have misplaced it, but that's fine. Right, so let me find my gap again. Right, okay, so here's my gap in the waistband, so I just use my bodkin and I can feel it through the fabric and just push it through, and then it just pulls the elastic through. Now what a good idea is to do at this point is to just take your other end of the elastic without twisting it, and just secure it to where the channel opening is. I'm just going to use a pin there, just so it doesn't get lost inside the channel as you're pulling it through, because then you'll just have to start all over again. Okay, so see, it's just really easy. Thread it through. Okay, it's coming out the other end now. Right, here we are. So then I just pull the ring down to loosen the hands, and it comes straight off again. So that's really easy. And then where I've pinned it down to the end here, completely untwisted, and I'm not twisting this bit either, I'm just going to overlap them slightly like that, pull my pin out and pin those pieces together. Okay, let's lose some more of that elastic in the channel so we can check it out. Okay, so now I've lost my pinned area, haven't I? Oh, inside the skirt. Okay, let me get that back out. Right, here we go. Okay, so now I can see that that elastic is in there, it's not twisted around. You really want to make sure that you check that, because you don't want to sew it, find out it's twisted, and then have to unpick it just because it's a pain. Okay, so I know that the elastic's not twisted, so I'm going to take that over to my machine and just flat stitch it, and I'll come back to you. Okay, I haven't done anything fancy here. I've just literally stitched forwards and backwards just to make it secure. Okay, and then that just pops in there, and I'll top stitch the rest of the casing down. So there you have it. There is one finished just below the knee length for me tiered skirt, and I've made it out of this Liberty cotton lawn, which has been in my stash for ages. Even though I love it, I was struggling to find something to make out of it, so I can see myself wearing this a lot. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you have a go and just enjoy playing around with your fabric and see what you can come up with. If you've never sewn without a pattern before, I really think that this is a great way to start. Just one last word is on the waistband, just because sometimes when these elasticate waistbands go through the wash, they can be a bit twisty. So to combat that, all I do is I top stitch it down just at the side seams and maybe at the centre back as well, and you can't see the top stitching because the gather hides it. So yeah, use the worksheet that I've provided as a reminder, but really just do your own thing with it. You can create all sorts of wonderful things. So have fun. Bye.